Welcome to episode 367 of the Postal Hub podcast. I'm Ian Kerr. Joining me in a moment are Kate Muth, Executive Director of IMAG, and Ellen McClain, Special Advisor to International Bridge. We're going to talk about low-value cross-border parcels, de minimis, and much more. Joining me on the line are Kate Muth and Ellen McClain. Kate is known to all of you. She's the Executive Director of IMAG, the International Mailers Advisory Group. And Ellen McClain is a Special Advisor to International Bridge and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary at Homeland Security, which I'm reliably informed includes Customs and Border Security. Border Security or Border Protection? CBP, isn't it? Customs and Border Protection. Got confused with Border Security, the excellent TV show. We're going to be talking today about a paper that's been recently released by the Future Borders Coalition, and the paper is called Saving E-Commerce, and it's looking at low-value shipments in the USA and Canada. So, Ellen and Kate, welcome to the podcast. Ellen, perhaps I can ask you just to give us a quick overview of low-value shipments and how they're defined, how they're handled, and what's happening at the moment with regard to these low-value shipments.
Thank you, Ian. So essentially, I want to give some context in answer to your question. The concept of low-value shipments, otherwise known as the de minimis exception, first appeared in customs law in 1938. At the time, the purpose appears to have been to exempt the collection of customs duties and taxes from returning travelers who were bringing back foreign souvenirs, right? Over time, the exemption increased. Today, the exemption applies to items the value of which is under $800 being imported by one person on one day. The exemption does not apply to goods subject to anti-dumping and countervailing duties, quota, certain IRS taxes, and some liquor and tobacco products. The purpose has also evolved. The 2016 amendment raising the threshold of the exemption to $800 has been described as designed to allow U.S. Customs and Border Protection, otherwise known as CBP, to direct its limited resources to more high-value targets. The de minimis exception is clearly on the radar of Congress, the White House, CBP, the U.S. Postal Service, other federal agencies, consumers, and small businesses, to name a few. There are a number of factors focused on the vulnerabilities of the de minimis exception, prompting all this attention. CBP has indicated that approximately 4 million de minimis shipments arrive in the U.S. on a daily basis, which equates to 92% of all cargo entering the U.S. The average value of each shipment is only $54. Concerns have been raised that bad actors are using this de minimis exception to enter goods or items violative of U.S. laws, such as illegal drugs, counterfeit goods, goods produced with forced labor, and many other items not in compliance with partner government agency requirements. CBP has testified that it costs them approximately $2,000 to process a seizure and forfeit or destroy the violative item. Obviously, enforcement actions against low-value illegal shipments puts a strain on CBP resources as well as staffing. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't touch on the benefits of the exemption, in part responsible for the tremendous growth in imports in recent years. The explosive growth in the importation of low-value shipments is due in part to benefits for small businesses with online retail sales and for consumers, particularly those located in remote areas. So, as my summary and the Future Borders Coalition report indicates, the issue of effectively enforcing U.S. laws in connection with de minimis shipments is complex. While additional data may permit CBP to shrink the haystack to identify and target low-value goods for inspection, ultimately it's likely that the answer lies in an approach using multiple methods.
Well, we have moved a long way from people bringing back souvenirs, haven't we? To basically, when we think about de minimis, we're really just thinking about e-commerce shipments. And everything that goes along with that. Kate, at the end there, Ellen sort of touched a bit on what the weaknesses are. So can you just go into that in a bit more depth? What are the weaknesses in the current system, and what are the areas that have been identified that require reform?
Yeah, so I think Ellen, she did a nice summary of kind of what some of the weaknesses are, but I think it's just a few things, the sheer amount of goods that are coming in. Obviously, the growth in the de minimis shipments, the low value goods that are shipped, some of that comes from the fact that the pandemic, where things change, e-commerce just absolutely boomed. We have that. Ellen also touched on the fact that perhaps Customs and Border Protection here in the U.S. and I think around the world, they're just sort of customs authorities were overwhelmed with all the goods that are coming in. So you have maybe not enough resources for checking everything that came through, just again, the sheer magnitude. And then I think some of the other weaknesses that we've heard and seen is that maybe the data isn't as good as it needs to be. We hear, and IMAG had a webinar about a year or so ago with CBSA up in Canada, their customs authority, and they said a lot of times what the descriptions for the goods are not very accurate, or they're not very good at all. You can't just put apparel or goods. You need better descriptions of the goods. So I think it has to do with better data, using the data better. That's one of the things that we recommend in the paper as well, is that the customs authorities need to make better use of the data and perhaps couple that with technology. And I know that's a piece of it that the paper really recommends as a way to improve screening and make better use of the data that they're already collecting, couple it with technology.
One of the things that Ellen mentioned in her introduction was that currently under the de minimis rules, it's $800 per person. Was it per person per week or something like that? Was that
per day?
Per day.
Per day. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lovely big loophole for people to pour themselves through, isn't it?
I mean, we don't like to use the word loophole because
I just use the word loophole. It's my podcast, and I can use whatever language I like if I want to run the risk of the censorship online. But let's call it the unintended consequences or side effects of an otherwise sensible rule. So we've talked about the weaknesses in the current system and the areas that require reform. You sort of touched there, Kate, upon technology and the data that's collected. So how can technology help improve the screening of these low value shipments? But especially since you said, what was it, $2,000 for an inspection and all of that sort of stuff. So how can technology help?
So at the outset, I just want to say that there's probably not one single solution. It's not a one-size-fits-all sort of approach that can deal with the magnitude of this. But there's many options out there that arguably used in combination can be applied to combat the introduction or shipment of illegal items using or abusing the de minimis exception. I advocate using many tools in the toolbox and using them in an innovative way. CBP recently published a proposed rule, the key objective of which is to authorize the collection of more data in advance of arrival to assist in its targeting operations. But going back to my initial premise, if this is the only solution pursued, CBP has neither the staff nor the funding, we just touched on the $2,000, and to process all potentially violative shipments. So a solution based solely on the collection of data is not likely to succeed by itself, right? But there are a number of potential solutions when used in combination and or by CBP leveraging industry partnerships could prove effective in combating the importation of illegal and potentially dangerous goods. Technology using artificial intelligence and machine learning to pre-screen items prior to sale or prior to shipment could potentially stop illegal goods at the foreign point of origin. Let me explain what I meant by leveraging private industry as a partner in stopping illegal goods prior to shipment. CBP could adopt a de minimis program as part of its Trusted Trader program, which is called Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, otherwise known as CTPAT. In essence, CBP could provide incentives such as expedited clearance for importers participating in this kind of program, deploying CBP-validated pre-screening technology stopping violative goods at the point of origin, and sharing information with CBP on rejected goods. This would in turn prevent circumvention of, if you stop at the point of origin, it wouldn't allow the platform, the seller, whoever, get it shipped in via other means. Other applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning under consideration could include the use and exchange of X-rays to assist in targeting, detection, and interdiction prior to shipment. Another area worth exploration concerns pre-clearance of goods. Canada and the U.S. are conducting a test in this area. You may be familiar with passenger pre-clearance, where CBP officers pre-clear travelers in a foreign airport location prior to departing to the U.S. And upon arrival, these passengers are free to leave the airport or connect without any further CBP processing. Future Borders Coalition's report recommends undertaking a study of technology solutions to identify best practices that could be effectively applied to prevent the introduction of illegal and harmful items into the U.S. At a minimum, the study should assess potentially effective technology with a focus on leveraging and incentivizing industry partnerships to act as a force multiplier in combating the illegal importation of violative goods via the de minimis exception.
And while we're talking about ways to improve the system, a way to combat, I used the word loophole before. Apparently, it's not the right word to use, but I'm going to use it again. Your report identified a few weaknesses and suggested quite a few recommendations, I think 5 or 6 recommendations. One of the recommendations related to fulfillment centres that exploit the LVS, the low value shipment. Again, I'm going to use the word loophole. It's probably a better word. But the strategy of evading the obligations for customs and all, et cetera, et cetera. So how can governments crack down on these fulfillment centers that basically sidestepping the intention of the regulations?
So I think I need to sort of explain a little more about fulfillment centers located in Canada and Mexico. Essentially, sellers, importers, whatever, bring them into those countries in bulk shipments, under bond usually, place them in a fulfillment center, which is essentially a warehouse, all right? And then they stage these low-value shipments. They break the bulk packages, and then they deliver these low-value shipments to purchasers in the United States, duty-free, duty and tax-free, and allows them to fulfill orders from U.S. customers and deliver them expeditiously. The challenge here is not one necessarily of enforcement, it's one of law. And so in 2020, CBP issued a ruling intended to advise the importing community about limitations of the de minimis exemption in connection with something called foreign trade zones located in the United States. Foreign trade zones, you're allowed to bring goods into foreign trade zones without having paid the duty. You pay the duty when you withdraw them from the foreign trade zone. So somebody had asked a question about, can I bring in a bulk amount shipment into a foreign trade zone and then break it into these de minimis orders and deliver them to U.S. parties? And CBP said no, for 2 basic reasons. CBP ruled that the law authorizing the de minimis exemption specifically prohibits the manipulation of the value of such goods to obtain the duty-free treatment. And that's what this ruling request dealt with, was can I bring it in and manipulate the package to take advantage of the exemption? CBP said no. They further based its decision on express language in the law that, and here's where it gets kind of technical legally, but supports the position that the determination of eligibility for the de minimis exemption occurs at the time the goods are imported rather than entered. And imported is defined as bringing within port limits with the intent to unload. So it's much earlier in this process. That's when the eligibility for the de minimis attaches. And so they said, no, it doesn't apply to goods being put in a foreign trade zone because they come in bulk and so they're not eligible for the exemption. So thus the issue becomes whether allowing the importation, right, under this law, and it appears, at least to me, that you would have to change the law, the longstanding law, okay, to allow this practice. And so I think that's a question worth further study. And I think it's also been challenged, not legally, but challenged as should we be leveling the playing field here?
And certainly a question that's being asked in various other jurisdictions around the world. This is not a uniquely USA problem, is it? It's something that, well, we've seen recently in Europe. We've got the, I can't remember what it stands for. IOSS. Kate, what's it stand for?
The import one-stop shop, or yeah.
Thank you very much. There we go. You've both passed. I've failed. There's been a lot of discussion about this globally. I know that all the cross-border technical people will be listening to this with great interest. So, Kate, I'll mention IOSS or iOS 2, however you want to call it. Would harmonization with IOSS help the US and Canada manage these low-value shipments? And so as part of that, does this also impact on air freight security? I know we've talked about illicit substances, we've talked about circumventing customs obligations, but there's also a security aspect to that. And we've seen that just in the last 12 months with items being placed on freighter aircraft that shouldn't have been there. So how about this? Would harmonization with IOSS help the situation?
I think what you're actually, from a security perspective, I think it's ICS2 that you're referring to, which is the European, security and control. IOSS is collecting of the VAT, but I'm going to address both of those issues because one of the things that we've recommended in comments, IMAG submitted comments to notices of proposed rulemaking that are now out that Customs and Border Protection has out regarding much of these topics that we're talking about, which is collection of more data and perhaps elimination of the de minimis exemption on certain goods. And one of the suggestions that we make is to take collection of revenue off the border. So consider periodic collection of revenues, those kinds of things, such as a quarterly remittance in batches. This is what IOSS does from a revenue collection standpoint. It takes it off the border, similar to what Australia and New Zealand do with a goods and services tax, which is done, the marketplace is the one that's responsible for collecting. And again, it takes it off the border. I think it's remitted quarterly. You may know better, Ian, on that. Oh, you don't? Okay. And then I think with ICS2, which is the import control system, I don't know that we can necessarily harmonize, but I think the concept is right. Correct? We're getting information in advance, and you can make decisions and determine safety and security further upstream, so to speak. So before the goods actually hit the border, and I think that's what we want to work towards. Both IMAG has argued in our comments to retain the de minimis exemption in some capacity. So revenue collection is that piece of it, but also as Ellen mentioned, the use of technology and the use of better partnership. And I'll just make one more comment on that. I was at an industry event this week, and the acting commissioner of CBP spoke, and he referenced the air security issue and the cargo. And he said that was an example of industry and CBP working collaboratively to address a very concerning issue. And so I think he sees that as something of a model, perhaps in the low value shipment approach as well.
Thanks, Kate. I don't think I've ever been corrected so gracefully before. Just while we're talking then about sort of consistencies and harmonisation, one of the things that we've talked about a few times in the past when we've talked about the Stop Act and when we've talked about changes to EAD or AED, whichever foot you have whichever camp you have your feet in. You know what I mean. Anyway.
I won't correct you on that one.
Well, everybody knows what I mean. AED, EAD. Can we just get consistent on that before we talk about harmonisation of anything else? But there have been inconsistencies between the treatment of postal items and the treatment of private courier cross-border items. Where are we with that, Kate? Are there any inconsistencies still, and do they need to be redressed?
Right. The tariff situation here in the U.S. really highlighted the inconsistencies there because we had, when the tariffs with China took effect, the additional 10% tariffs. And with that first executive order, it also called, the Trump administration called for the elimination of initially of the de minimis exemption. And what we discovered is, well, what we knew, but what was really highlighted is that Postal Service has no mechanism to collect duties and taxes and to then remit that to turn that over to CBP. We also know that the Postal Service, or in the postal channel, the country of origin is not a required data element. It's optional. So if you are not entirely sure what country they're coming from, you can't collect duties and taxes. And if you don't have a mechanism to do that, you cannot collect duties and taxes. Now, an amended executive order went out, and it also amended the executive orders on tariffs for for Canada and Mexico, that we will keep the de minimis exemption in place until such time that Postal Service and CBP can come up with an efficient collection mechanism. So that's one piece that's very obvious right there.
With respect to the U.S. Postal Service not collecting as a data element country of origin, this is not a simple concept. There's no definition in customs law for country of origin. There are rules. You know, where was the yarn sewn into the sweater and where? Okay, so the country of origin can change under these rules depending on the type of manufacturing or production that's done. So it would be difficult, I think, very difficult for U.S. Postal Service to, they'd have to have a whole nother team working on country of origin determinations for de minimis goods. So that would be a challenge. The other thing I think you mentioned about the advanced carrier information that's provided to CBP before departure of an aircraft. And that law or that regulation was designed to prevent the introduction of hazardous and flammable and explosive materials being carried on board the aircraft, and calls for, if a determination is made that there is something on the plane in the belly of the aircraft or whatever that shouldn't be there, they go to extraordinary lengths to take it off the plane. The only reason I mention that is because we're hearing some concerns about stopping the goods at point of origin, that you have to unload the whole plane to get to the little de minimis box of tennis sneakers, right? So the idea would be to push it back before it gets on board the plane, since unloading it would be a operational logistical nightmare.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface with this topic in many regards, but we have to wind it up in a moment. This has been a sort of a continuing conversation, though, hasn't it, Kate? We mentioned that we've talked about the Stop Act, and we've talked about various things over the years with regard to cross-border e-commerce coming through the postal system. And right now we are in a very dynamic situation with regard to topics such as tariffs. So really, everybody in the postal and broader delivery sector needs to keep on their toes right now, don't they? I mean, there's no other way of putting it. Right now, you've got to be on your toes, and you've got to have the data right, I suppose, if you want to have any chance of complying with whatever regulations or tariffs or rulings are in place. Is that really the situation?
I think that is the situation, and I know and one day you and I will have a conversation about something other than this topic, but it does keeps us engaged. But I would say that one of the very important things is, use a service provider, use some of the compliance tools. There's a bunch of companies out there that offer compliance tools. All of your service providers are plugged in on these issues. And I think joining a trade association isn't a bad idea either, because these are the places where you share the information. And as I said, your service provider will be on top of this or know the right compliance tools to point you to. But it is so fast changing. I mean, by the time you probably post this, we'll have put tariffs on and taken them off, 2 or 3 times. So it's just a fast moving situation.
Certainly it's not boring at the moment in the transport and logistics sector, is it? Now, the report is called, Saving E-Commerce, and it is available from the Future Borders Coalition website. And that website is futureborderscoalition.org. Go over there and you can download the report. I'll put a link to that on the episode page on the Postal Hub website. So if you're out walking the dog or just lying on a beach contemplating life, when you get back to your computer, you'll be able to download the report and read The background and the recommendations that come from the report is a very interesting read. I recommend having a look at it. Kate Muth, Executive Director of IMAG, and Ellen McClain, Special Advisor to International Bridge. Thank you both very much for joining us on the Postal Hub podcast today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
That's all for this episode of the Postal Hub podcast. Please do subscribe to the podcast in your favourite podcast player like Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Amazon Music. And please do subscribe to my newsletter. Go to thepostalhub.com and follow the links to sign up for my email newsletter that goes out every time there's a new episode of the podcast. Or you can sign up for the Daily Delivery Digest if you want to get an email from me every weekday with all the headlines from around the delivery world. You can follow me on LinkedIn. Just look me up on LinkedIn. Ian Kerr is my name, Kerr. And you don't have to send a connection request or anything like that. You can just follow me. And my content won't be as awful as the other stuff that's out there. There's a ring bit of self-endorsement, isn't it? Not as bad as the other rubbish that's on LinkedIn. Anyway, follow me on LinkedIn if you want something interesting in your LinkedIn feed, as opposed to a lot of the, you know what, that's out there at the moment on LinkedIn. Now, do it now before LinkedIn jumps the shark like many other social media platforms have. If you want to email me, my email address is ian@thepostalhub.com. I'm Ian Kerr. Thanks for listening in, and I look forward to your company next time on the Postal Hub podcast.